Well, a couple of examples. So one example is the changes that were introduced for passenger baggage. We introduced the same sorts of changes for air cargo. So if you're Federal Express or you're shipping stuff by air, from a business perspective, there were changes introduced to allow the way in which cargo is inspected and dealt with in the air transport mode. That was now harmonized with the US, and so we were able to reduce duplication. We made changes so that if you were a shipper who had enrolled in a trusted shipper program, so this requires a bit of explanation. So if you're a shipper, either in Canada or the US, you can enroll in a program sponsored by the government and go through a bunch of checks and audits and so on. And then if you pass all that, you're deemed to be trusted. And what that does is it gives you faster passage across the border because you're now considered a trusted trader. Well, under the old rules, Canada had a trusted trader program and the US had a trusted trader program. And the requirements were very similar. But you couldn't enroll in one and get the benefits of the other. So if you were somebody shipping back and forth across the border regularly, what you had to do is you had to enroll in the Canadian program and you had to enroll in the US program. So it's like having two gym memberships, even though even though you should be able to enroll once and then go to any gym you want across the country. So we actually changed the rules so that now you can enroll in one and be accepted into both programs. So it cuts the paperwork, cuts the expense. The area where I feel where we maybe haven't made as much progress because it's still kind of a work in progress, is on the smaller set of items in the agreement that I would characterize as transformational. So the idea was we wanted to move border management to a completely new way of thinking in which we would push the management of threats beyond the border. So there's a lot of cargo, for example, that comes into Canada in Vancouver or Halifax and then crosses the border and goes into the US. There's also cargo and passengers and so on who come into the US, for example, through New Jersey or Long Beach, California, and then crosses into Canada. So the idea was, why can't we do some of those inspections at the first port of arrival in North America? And if you do that at the first port of arrival, it should allow you to cut down the inspection that happens at the 49th parallel. Well, we've launched a number of pilot projects involving shipping of cargo and so on. They're in their early stages. I'm hoping that they're going to become permanent, they'll be expanded. Those were the areas that I would say were truly transformational, where we're only now just kind of beginning to put the pilot programs in place to test their viability. But the idea would be that you would do the screening when you first arrive in North America, or perhaps even overseas before the airplane or the ship even leaves. And once you've done that, you'd cut down the amount of inspection that actually happens at the physical border, at the land border between the two countries. I think the fact that I reported to the Prime Minister was very helpful because the Prime Minister is the head of government and so his authority carries a lot of weight. But I think that wasn't sufficient because, it was necessary, but it wasn't sufficient because people aren't necessarily just going to listen to you because you're working for the Prime Minister. A lot of my colleagues were concerned isn't maybe the right word, but they had questions, I guess, about would some of the commitments that I would be making to the Americans cost a lot of money? Would they receive the money in the budget necessary to actually live up to the commitments? Would I be proposing changes that they would find difficult to implement? From the perspective of some of the colleagues that I worked with, they're running very large organizations. So for example, the Canada Border Services Agency is a huge organization with thousands of people. The Deputy Minister of that organization is running a big operation, and he can't afford to have somebody like me running off and making a bunch of commitments that aren't funded, that don't make sense, and so on. Well, I made a very concerted effort to make sure that I brought them all in the tent. There was a standing group of deputy ministers called the DMs, the Deputy Ministers Border Task Force. This was a regular group of deputy ministers that met every couple of months to talk about border management issues. So I came to the Border Management Task Force regularly to update them in the progress that was being made. I personally went and sat down with every one of my colleagues to talk to them about what we had in mind. I consulted them very closely on the negotiations as they were moving ahead. The way we actually structured the discussions, what what we did was come up with a term sheet with the Americans. Here are the items that we're going to work on. But then the actual work on each item was led by the responsible ministry. So if you take, for example, citizenship and immigration, we agreed with the Americans to make certain improvements to the way in which we managed business travelers. Business travel back and forth between the two countries is an important issue commercially. We don't want our business travelers to be hassled very much. So we agreed with the Americans, here is what we aim to do to fix business travel. But then the actual development of the proposals, a lot of the detail, those actually originated with our citizenship and immigration ministry. So I asked each of my colleagues to nominate one of their very senior people who would actually lead the work in each area. Now, at the end of the day, that work all had to come back to me. I had to vet it, make sure it passed muster. If I had questions, I'd go back to the ministry. I might even call my deputy minister colleague. But I think if you talk to them, they had a sense all along that they were involved. And I think what happened at some point was, perhaps some of them started to see this as an opportunity, that this was a high priority item being led by the Prime Minister and the President of the United States. I was consulting with them closely. But at the end of the day, this was maybe an opportunity to actually get some things done, address some operational problems. And the fact that I was consulting and talking to them regularly and reassuring them that I wasn't forgetting about their needs and interests, I think was very helpful. I think the biggest hurdle initially was maybe skepticism, institutional skepticism, business community skepticism. I think fatigue isn't the right word because there hadn't been a major initiative on the border for a number of years. But I think there was just a certain inertia because this was a huge undertaking. There was a potential for, this it done right. It would cost money. That would require legislative change. I mean, it just looked like a big undertaking, and there had been previous attempts that hadn't really produced results.